November 8, 1942. Before dawn, the dark waters off North Africa began to fill with shapes, American transports, British warships, landing craft rocking in the surf. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a decision made months earlier in distant conference rooms was about to become reality in fire, steel, and blood. For the United States, this was more than an invasion. It was a test. Less than a year after entering World War II, America was finally stepping into the fight against Hitler in a major way. Not with promises, not with lend-lease, not with speeches, with soldiers. This is where our countdown begins. To rank the 5 American war decisions that altered World War II forever, we are not just looking at battlefield success alone. We are looking at impact. Which decisions changed the shape of the war, shifted Allied momentum, and forced the Axis into a new and more dangerous future. Some were bold, some were ruthless, some remain controversial to this day, but each one left a mark so deep that the war could never return to what it had been before. At number 5 is the Torch Decision, the choice to open the war in North Africa. The plan was approved in 1942 after fierce debate between American and British leaders. Many American commanders wanted a direct strike into France as soon as possible. They feared that attacking North Africa would delay the real showdown with Germany. But the British, led by Winston Churchill, pushed for a Mediterranean strategy first. In the end, President Franklin D. Roosevelt backed the operation. It was a compromise, but also a turning point. The result was Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, with landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. For the first time, large numbers of American troops entered the European North African theater against German-linked forces. That fact alone made Torch historic. But what made it truly war-altering was what came after. Torch did not just put American boots on the ground. It opened the door to a chain reaction that would pull Axis power backward, step by step, toward disaster. The campaign was not clean. American forces were inexperienced. Coordination was shaky. Command structures were still maturing. In some places, resistance was confused and chaotic. In others, it was sharp and deadly. Then came the brutal lessons of Tunisia and later the humiliation at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, where German forces under Erwin Rommel exposed American weaknesses in command, armor handling, and battlefield discipline. But that is exactly why the Torch Decision mattered. It forced the United States Army to grow up fast. North Africa became the proving ground where America learned how to fight the German war machine for real. Officers were tested. Bad assumptions were punished. Tactics were rewritten under fire. Leaders like Eisenhower gained crucial experience handling multinational operations, coalition politics, logistics, and large-scale planning. The battlefield was hard, but the education was priceless, and the strategic gains were enormous. Torch trapped Axis forces in North Africa between British armies advancing from the east and Anglo-American forces pressing from the west. By May 1943, nearly 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia were lost, a catastrophe often compared to a second Stalingrad in scale. North Africa was gone. The Mediterranean began to crack open. From there came the invasion of Sicily in 1943, the fall of Mussolini, and the long campaign into Italy. The Axis was now being attacked on yet another front. That is why German leaders could not dismiss Torch as a sideshow. It marked the moment America stopped being a future threat and became a present one. It also carried psychological weight. For Allied populations, Torch was proof that the United States was fully in the war against Germany. For the Axis, it was the first clear sign that American industrial power would not remain safely across the Atlantic. It had arrived at the battlefield, and it was only getting started. The Torch Decision did not end the war. It did not destroy Germany. It was not the most dramatic decision America would make. But it changed the direction of the conflict. It opened the European war to direct American action, forged the inexperienced U.S. Army into a more dangerous force, and began the steady rollback of Axis control in the Mediterranean. It was the first major American offensive against Germany's world, and once that door opened, it would never close again. But North Africa was only possible because of an even bigger choice, one made before the landings, before the first convoy crossed the Atlantic, before most Americans fully understood what kind of war they had entered. December 1941. Pearl Harbor was still burning in the national memory. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were surging with terrifying speed. The Philippines were under siege. Wake Island was falling. Guam was lost. To the American public, the obvious enemy seemed clear. Japan had struck first. Japan had humiliated the United States, and Japan was the face of immediate rage. Yet in Washington, another decision took shape, colder, broader, and far more strategic. The Germany First strategy, formally embraced in 1941 to 1942, was the decision to make Nazi Germany the main target of Allied grand strategy, even while fighting Japan in the Pacific. On paper, it sounded almost unnatural. The nation that attacked America would not be the first one fully crushed. Instead, the United States would focus its greatest military-industrial effort on Hitler. It was one of the most important strategic decisions of the entire war. The logic behind it was brutal but clear. Germany was seen as the more dangerous long-term enemy: stronger industry, deadlier armed forces, deeper technological capacity, and the ability to dominate Europe completely if left unchecked. Japan was dangerous, yes, but Germany had the greater potential to reshape the world in a way the Allies might not be able to reverse. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with British leaders and American military planners such as General George C. Marshall, understood that if Germany defeated the Soviet Union, consolidated Europe, and turned its full strength outward, the war could become nearly unwinnable. So even as American sailors, Marines, and soldiers bled in the Pacific, the grand strategic priority remained fixed: defeat Germany first. It was a decision created in late 1941, reinforced through Allied conferences, and it shaped everything that followed. It shaped shipping priorities across the Atlantic. It shaped aircraft production. It shaped troop deployment. It shaped Lend-Lease aid. It shaped bombing strategy. And it shaped the calendar of the war itself. Without Germany first, there may have been no torch in 1942, no vast buildup in Britain, no strategic bombing campaign at the same scale, and perhaps no D-Day when it finally came. The decision turned the European theater into the center of gravity for American power. That did not mean the Pacific was ignored. Far from it. The United States still fought massive campaigns against Japan, built fleets of astonishing size, and launched offensive operations across the ocean. But the deepest pool of national energy, the long-term strategic design, was aimed at Germany. This choice demanded discipline because it ran against emotion. The American people wanted revenge against Japan. Many military leaders had to balance public anger with strategic necessity. That tension never fully disappeared, but the decision held. And because it held, the Allies were able to concentrate on the most dangerous core of the Axis system. Its combat achievements cannot be measured in a single battle, because Germany First was not one operation. It was the framework behind many operations. It enabled the Atlantic lifeline to Britain. It justified the commitment of men and material to North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. It helped sustain the Soviet Union through shipments that kept the Eastern Front alive. It gave coherence to Allied planning in a global war that could easily have become fragmented by panic and revenge. Its greatest achievement was unity. In a war fought across continents and oceans, Germany First prevented the Allies from scattering their strength. It forced them to think strategically instead of emotionally. It recognized that wars are not won by striking the nearest enemy hardest, but by breaking the enemy whose survival would make all other victories meaningless. And history proved the calculation right. By May 1945, Germany was destroyed first. Only then, with Europe secure, could the United States and its allies bring overwhelming final pressure to bear on Japan. The sequence mattered, the order mattered, the decision mattered. That is why Germany First stands at number 4 on this list. It was not as visible as an invasion, not as dramatic as a bomb, and not as cinematic as soldiers storming beaches. But it silently shaped the architecture of Allied victory. It answered the biggest strategic question America faced after Pearl Harbor: who must fall first? The answer determined the entire flow of the war. And once that answer was chosen, millions of tons of steel, fuel, bombs, ships, and men began moving in the same direction, toward Germany. While Germany remained the main enemy in global strategy, the Pacific could not wait. The United States still had to fight across an ocean so vast it seemed to swallow fleets, armies, and entire timetables. And in that brutal theater, another American decision emerged, one that changed the rhythm of war itself. Not every enemy stronghold had to be taken. That idea sounds obvious now. In 1942 and 1943, it was revolutionary. At number 3 is the island hopping strategy. The decision, developed in 1943 to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, seize key islands instead, and use them as stepping stones toward Japan. It was a strategy of selective violence. Hit what matters, isolate what does not, and keep moving. The Pacific map was filled with Japanese bases that looked untouchable. Places like Rabaul were turned into massive fortresses, layered with airfields, guns, ships, and troops. The traditional instinct would have been to attack them head-on, one by one, paying for every mile with blood. But American planners, led by figures such as Admiral Chester Nimitz, General Douglas MacArthur, and their staffs, began shaping a different answer. Why destroy every fortress when you could leave some to rot? That was the heart of the decision. Instead of assaulting every Japanese strongpoint, the Americans would capture islands with strategic value, airfields, anchorages, staging points, then use naval and air power to cut off the bypassed garrisons. Thousands of Japanese troops would be left stranded, armed but irrelevant, slowly starved of fuel, supplies, ammunition, and purpose. In a war where distance was everything, island hopping turned geography into a weapon. Its first great proving ground came after the grinding struggle for Guadalcanal, as Allied forces pushed through the Solomons and New Guinea. By 1943 to 1944, the strategy became unmistakable. Rather than smash directly into every bastion, American forces jumped forward, seized the next critical point, and forced the Japanese to watch entire defensive networks become useless behind them. Its combat achievements were enormous. The bypassing of Rabaul is one of the clearest examples. Once considered one of Japan's most powerful bases in the South Pacific, it should have required a monstrous invasion. Instead, it was isolated by air and sea. Its garrison survived, but it no longer mattered. A fortress without mobility is just a prison with guns. The strategy then accelerated across the Central Pacific. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Leyte, Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa all became part of a larger chain. Not random battles, but selected blows aimed at cracking the Japanese defense system layer by layer. Some of these battles were still horrifically costly. Island hopping was not bloodless. Tarawa alone proved how savage an amphibious assault could be. Peleliu became a nightmare. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were apocalyptic. But the key difference was this: America was choosing where to fight. That choice altered the war forever. Japanese planners had built their empire on the assumption that an attacker would have to grind through every outer defense ring. Island hopping shattered that logic. Entire garrisons, sometimes tens of thousands of troops, were rendered strategically dead without ever being fully defeated in battle. The United States refused to fight on Japan's terms. It created a moving front, constantly shifting, constantly threatening the next island, the next airfield, the next sea lane. The results reached far beyond the battlefield. Capturing the Mariana Islands in 1944 placed the new B-29 superfortress within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. That alone changed the nature of the war. The Pacific was no longer only a naval struggle of carriers and amphibious landings. It became a direct air offensive against Japan itself. Factories, cities, and infrastructure were now within reach. That is the deepest achievement of island hopping. It compressed time. By refusing to waste strength on every fortress, the United States moved faster toward the center of Japanese power. It accelerated the destruction of the empire. It preserved resources where a slower campaign might have bled them away. And it taught one of the central lessons of modern warfare. Sometimes the most decisive victory is not the enemy position you capture, but the one you force the enemy to abandon without a fight. This was not just a Pacific tactic. It was a strategic philosophy. Strike what matters, skip what does not. Let isolation finish what invasion would cost too much to achieve. That is why island hopping takes the number 3 spot. It was bold, efficient, and ruthless in the most American way possible. applying industrial strength and operational mobility to turn the enemy's own defensive depth into a weakness. And as the chain of captured islands stretched westward, one truth became unavoidable. Japan was no longer being contained, it was being hunted. And as Japan was being hunted across the Pacific, the greatest question in Europe still remained. When would the Allies return to France? For years, that question haunted the war. Stalin demanded it. Hitler feared it. The British approached it with caution. The Americans pushed for it with growing urgency. Everyone understood the truth. Sooner or later, the Western Allies would have to cross the English Channel and strike directly into Nazi-occupied Europe. The only uncertainty was when and at what cost. At number 2 is the D-Day commitment, the decision, finalized in 1943 to 1944, to launch the invasion of France and open the decisive Western Front against Hitler. This was not just a military plan. It was a political, industrial, and civilizational gamble. The operation that emerged from that decision became Operation Overlord, launched on June 6, 1944. But the true turning point came before a single soldier hit the beaches. It came when American leadership, with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, General George C. Marshall, and Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, committed fully to the idea that the liberation of Western Europe would begin with a direct assault on Nazi defenses in France. That commitment changed everything. It meant gathering an invasion force on a scale the world had never seen. It meant shipping hundreds of thousands of men to Britain, stockpiling mountains of fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies, and coordinating land, sea, and air forces into one gigantic blow. It meant deception operations to convince the Germans that the real attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. It meant building artificial harbors, preparing airborne drops, mapping beaches, studying tides, rehearsing landings, and accepting in advance that thousands might die in the first hours, because everyone knew the stakes. If D-Day failed, Hitler's hold on Western Europe would tighten, Allied credibility would shatter. Soviet forces would continue bearing the vast weight of the European war alone. The liberation of France could be delayed by months, perhaps longer. In the worst case, the entire course of the war in Europe could be thrown into uncertainty. That is why the decision belongs this high on the list. Its combat achievements were monumental. On June 6th, American, British, and Canadian troops stormed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches. American airborne forces dropped inland in the dark. Naval guns roared from offshore. At Omaha Beach, the landings came terrifyingly close to disaster, with machine gun fire tearing through the first waves. But the invasion held. The beachheads survived, and once they survived, the doom of Nazi Germany became a matter of time. From that foothold came the liberation of Cherbourg, the breakout from Normandy, the encirclement at the Falaise Pocket, the liberation of Paris in August 1944, and the relentless advance toward Germany's western border. The Wehrmacht was now trapped between two gigantic forces, the Western Allies from France and the Soviets from the East. Hitler's empire was being crushed from both sides. That is the strategic achievement of the D-Day commitment. It created the Western Front that Germany could no longer survive. And beyond the battlefield, the decision carried moral and political weight almost beyond measure. D-Day was not merely an invasion. It was the visible beginning of Europe's liberation. For occupied peoples, it was hope made real. For the resistance, it was the long-awaited sign that the free world had returned in force. For Germany, it was the moment the war became irreversibly unwinnable in the West. Even Hitler's Atlantic Wall, so heavily advertised as an iron barrier, was exposed for what it truly was: formidable, deadly, but not enough. That is why this decision altered the war forever. It transformed Allied strength into direct continental power. It converted preparation into invasion, invasion into liberation, and liberation into collapse. Once the United States committed to D-Day, the war in Europe entered its final act. Not its easiest act, not its least bloody, but its decisive one. Because after June 6, 1944, Germany was no longer defending victory. Germany was defending defeat. And yet, even as Germany collapsed in Europe, another war still burned on. In the Pacific, Japan was wounded but not finished. Its navy had been shattered, its air power broken, its cities increasingly vulnerable, and its empire rolled back island by island. But surrender did not come. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 showed the nightmare clearly. Japanese resistance would be fanatical, civilian losses would be catastrophic, and any invasion of the home islands might become one of the bloodiest operations in human history. That is where our number one decision begins. The atomic bomb decision, made in 1945 under President Harry S. Truman, was the choice to use a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen in order to force Japan's surrender. It remains the most controversial American decision of World War II, not only because it ended the conflict, but because it opened the nuclear age and changed the future of warfare forever. The roots of this decision stretched back to 1942, when the United States launched the Manhattan Project, the secret program to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could do the same. It became one of the greatest scientific and industrial undertakings in history, bringing together figures such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, General Leslie Groves, and thousands of scientists, engineers, soldiers, and workers across hidden sites in the United States. By July 1945, after the successful Trinity test in New Mexico, the bomb was no longer theory. It was real, and now America had to decide whether to use it. By that point, Japan's situation was grim. American submarines had strangled its shipping. Strategic bombing was devastating its cities. Firebombing, especially the March 1945 raid on Tokyo, had already killed enormous numbers of civilians. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan. Still, Tokyo did not surrender unconditionally, and American leaders feared that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, could cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and perhaps far more Japanese military and civilian deaths. So the decision was made. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb struck Nagasaki. Between those attacks, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, destroying any remaining hope in Tokyo that Moscow might mediate peace on favorable terms. The result was historic. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. That alone would make this the most war-altering decision on the list. But its impact went far beyond ending the Pacific War. Its immediate combat achievement was absolute strategic shock. Unlike D-Day, which opened a front, or island hopping, which compressed a campaign, the atomic bomb decision shattered the political and military structure of Japanese resistance almost instantly. It demonstrated that one aircraft carrying one weapon could erase a city. No fortress, no fleet, no army doctrine had prepared the world for that reality. And that is why this decision ranks number one in danger and consequence. It did not merely alter a campaign, it altered civilization. The bomb ended World War II, but it also created a new kind of fear, one no nation could ever fully escape again. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, military power would forever be measured not only in divisions, ships, and aircraft, but in nuclear capability. The post-war world, the Cold War, deterrence theory, arms races, mutually assured destruction, all of it emerged from this moment. That is also why the decision remains morally contested. Supporters argue it ended the war quickly and prevented an even greater bloodbath. Critics argue Japan was already near defeat and that the use of atomic weapons against cities crossed a line humanity should never have crossed. Historians still debate not only whether it was necessary, but whether it was intended as much to shape the post-war balance of power as to end the war itself. But whatever judgment one makes, one fact cannot be denied. After August 1945, the world was no longer the same world. That is what makes the atomic bomb decision the most consequential American war decision of World War II. It ended the deadliest war in history with two blinding flashes, and in doing so, it opened an age in which human beings finally possessed the power to destroy themselves completely. From Torch in North Africa, to Germany First, to island hopping, to D-Day, and finally to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these were the decisions that did not just influence World War II. They redirected it, they accelerated it, they expanded it. And in the final case, they ended it at a cost that still echoes across history. Some decisions win battles, some decisions win wars, and some decisions change the fate of the human story itself. And if you've stayed until this final moment, thank you. If you want to keep exploring events like this, deeper, more real. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.